This podcast has been brought to you by Seeker's Guidance, the Global Islamic Seminary. Help us spread the light of prophetic guidance to millions around the world by becoming a monthly supporter. Make a small donation at seekersguidance.org/donate. For as little as $10 a month, you can help people find life-changing guidance.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah. In discussing certain aspects which impede the progress of our soul and obstruct the soul's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the ultimate relationship, which is the point upon which all tranquility is dependent, we want to talk about another issue which is constantly mentioned throughout the Quran and throughout the prophetic teachings, which is the ideal of fitnatul mal, the tribulation of wealth. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Inna likulli ummatin fitnatan, wa fitnatu ummati al-mal." He said, indeed, every community or every nation has a tribulation, and the tribulation of my nation is wealth. Now, it's important to understand that wealth in and of itself is not good or bad. It is what it is. And in fact, the Quran uses the word khayr in place of the word wealth. إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ. He says that indeed the human is severely in love with khayr, with good, and khayr here is the intention behind it is the word wealth. Now, wealth in and of itself is not a good or bad thing, and it is part of the taba' of the human being, the human nature, the human temperament, to incline towards things of value. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? And Islam has in two different aspects, right? There's the idea of receiving and attaining wealth, and then there's the idea of spending wealth, right? So in both of these aspects, Islam has guidance for the human being, because the lower self or the base desires of the human can very easily be attracted to wealth, either for wealth just for wealth's sake, or the utility of wealth in fulfilling sinful desires, as well as the utility of wealth in inflating the ego. Right, so there are certain aspects of the wealth where humans have a proclivity to go to extremes and to go to illicit avenues, whereas wealth can also be a source of great good. It can also be a source of drawing nearer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it could be a great source of what's called infaq, spending for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, the difference between these two extremes, or these two states, I should say, is the heart of the human, or the soul, right, as we're discussing. Right, so if the soul of the human being is muzakka, if it's purified, then it will see wealth as a means to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It will see wealth as khayr, as good, as something that can be used to draw the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the ridwan, the divine contentment. However, if a person's nafs is their lower self, if their soul is khabith, right, it is not purified, it is not disciplined, but rather it is left adulterated and with ulterior motives and self-interests in mind, then wealth is for that person will be detrimental. Right, so we're given throughout the Quran many different examples of people, right, with regards to wealth. We're given the example of Sulaiman alayhi salam, right, who has control over the east and the west and the wind and the jinn and the humans, and he has great possessions, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, هذا عطاؤنا فمن أو أمسك بغير حساب, right? This is our gift to you, so give or keep of it as you wish without reckoning. So that's one example, right? But at the same time, we have an example of a person named Qarun from the people of Musa alayhi salam. And Qarun, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that he was given such a treasure that the keys of that treasure would not be carried except by a large group of people who are strong, right? So, but the people at his time, they admonished Qarun and they said, "La tafrah, inna Allah la yuhibbul farihin." Don't be arrogant. And so here we see one point, right? That wealth can be a means of inflating the ego. They said, "Do not be arrogant. Verily, Allah does not love the arrogant." Right? And then they gave him a few advices. They said, first and foremost, and this is the central way that the believer should act with regards to wealth. They said, وَابْتَغِي فِي مَا آتَاكَ اللَّهُ الدَّارَ الْآخِرَةَ. Seek by means of that which Allah has given you the abode of the hereafter, meaning seek paradise by that which Allah has given you. Now, in the wording of this verse, there's some very beautiful nuances. One, there is a direct admonishment to Qarun by means of saying that the wealth that you have is bima atak Allah, is that which Allah has given you. Right. So part of the teachings of our deen is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the provider, and there is no provider other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? وَهُوَ يُطْعِمُ وَلَا يُطْعَمُ. Right? Allah reminds us constantly throughout the Quran that He is the one who feeds you and He is not fed. Right? That He is the one who provides you. That we are not asking you of provision, rather we provide you. Constantly Allah is reminding us this in the Quran. Right? And if a person, right, were to realize, right, with certainty this reality, and all of their illicit relationships with wealth, right, would fall aside, and as well as their worries and their anxieties over that wealth. Right? Because understanding the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only provider, that what we have of wealth, right, and provision is not limited to just money or wealth, right? Rather it is anything that benefits. Anything and everything that benefits us, right, is provision from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, if we understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only provider, right, and that regardless of what we do in this life, our provision is already promised and has already been decreed before we were even created, before we were even born into this world, and that nothing that we can do is going to increase the amounts of our provision, nor nothing that can be done or that we can do that can decrease what we've been decreed of provision. So if a person really understands that, right, then they will not be afraid of giving, and they will not be afraid of being generous, and generosity is directly correlated with courage, right? So one of the blameworthy traits of the soul, of the heart, is bukhul, right? Miserliness, and bukhul is directly correlated with jubn, with cowardice. Right? Because it takes courage to give of that which you have earned, right? And having certainty, and doing so while having certainty that Allah, who provided you in the first place, will provide you furthermore, right? As well as, right, certainty in the promises of the Prophet ﷺ and the promises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah will increase, right? That Allah will increase you by your giving of what Allah has blessed you with. Right? And if we look in the beginning of the Quran, when Allah is describing the qualities of the people of taqwa, right? Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. Right? Alif Lam Mim, that is the book in which there is no doubts, guidance for those of taqwa. Right? And Allah describes the people of taqwa. Who are they? الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ, those who believe in the unseen. Right? So there we have certainty. Certainty in things which we may not be able to perceive tangibly with our senses. Right? Allah tells us that wealth is not decreased by charity. Right? So those who believe in the unseen, وَيُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةِ, and they establish the prayer, وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ, and from that which we have provided them, they spend. Right? So these three qualities are directly related to the soul. Right? And by these three qualities, these specific three qualities that are mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah in the first few verses, a person will attain the best of this world as well as the best of the next. Right? So first is belief in the unseen. Right? What does that entail? Right? Belief in the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the provider, regardless of what we see as the means of the provision coming to us. And this is a very big test in this world. Right? And this is a test that we face every single day. And very few are those who truly understand its being a test and truly understand what is sought from them in that test. Right? So for instance, you go to work 40 hours a week. Right? You commute every day, you go to work, you're tired, you commute home, right? Then you come home. Right? At the end of the month, you cash your check, then you take that money and you go to the grocery store and you buy groceries for your family. Then you come home and you cut up the vegetables and you cook the food and you prepare the meal. Then finally, after slaving over the stove for an hour or two, you finally sit down in front of a meal. Now at that moment, the Prophet ﷺ teaches us before eating to say a certain dua. Right? We say Bismillah, right? That in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then when we're finished eating that meal, we say Alhamdulillahi alladhi at'amana wa saqana wa ja'alana min al-muslimin. All praise is due to the one who fed us and gave us drink and made us amongst the Muslims. Now at that moment is the real test. Because are you going to ascribe that food, which is your provision, right, or that check, or that money, or whatever it may be, are you going to ascribe it to your efforts, to your hard work, to your commuting, to your 40 hours a week, to your doing, or are you going to ascribe it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who brought you that provision, and your efforts and your job and your work are merely the means by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did so. Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of the means, but the means are the test. Right? Are you going to ascribe the credit of that provision to the means, i.e. to yourself, or are you going to ascribe the credit of that provision to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is unseen? Right? And Allah is telling us that He is the one who is providing, regardless of what the means are. Right? So there's a test, right? To ascribe, right? To believe in the unseen, to have full conviction on what's going on behind the scenes, behind the means, right? Because the means, right, have no true effect in the results. So with that, right, we see in the story of Qarun that after Qarun was admonished, right, to not be arrogant and to use that which Allah has given him, right, to seek the hereafter, right, what was his response? He says, إِنَّمَا أُوتِيتُهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ عِنْدِي. I was only given this wealth because of my knowledge. Right? So he ascribed the provision to himself, to his own efforts, to his own wits and his cleverness. Right? Right? So these archetypes that are mentioned in the Quran, right, are very important, because am I the Qarun in this situation? Am I ascribing the provisions that I have to myself, thus inflating my ego, right? Thus, right, and ascribing the credit of any blessing to other than the bestower of blessings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is called ujub, right? It's called self-conceit or vanity, right? These are very detrimental things to the heart, right? So if a person can fully realize within themselves that all their provision is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is not due to any means, right, that it's directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they can begin to adopt some of the praiseworthy qualities with regards to wealth, which are generosity, right, second, right, complete tawakkul, reliance in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, and third, what is qana'ah, right, contentment with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives, right, and right, so the Prophet ﷺ, he warned us about this, that the human being has a proclivity to want more and more and more, to be covetous when it comes to wealth. And this covetousness, again, is a detrimental quality to the soul, right? And we find that this is one of the overwhelming qualities that is universal, that people have, right, constantly in these days, that there's a covetousness for more material things, for more wealth, for a bigger house, for a bigger car, for the newest phone, for the newest technology, for the nicest car, and so forth, right? And all of that comes from one of the source detrimental qualities, which is love of this world, right? And the Prophet said, "Hubb ad-dunya ra'su kulli khati'ah." Love of worldliness is the source of all sins. Love of worldliness is the source of all sins, right? So the person who is being tested by having these, right, having an intrinsic longing or a covetousness for material things, right, for money, for possessions, for fame, for status, right, then for them it'll be very difficult for them to seek that which is greater, which is the hereafter, right? And it suffices that the Prophet ﷺ said, right, أَكْثِرُ مِنْ ذِكْرِ هَادِمِ اللَّذَّاتِ, constantly remember the thing that destroys all pleasures, I mean all fleeting pleasures, the pleasures of this world, which is death, right? So if a person does base their life on the pursuit of wealth and status, right, which is what the lower self, the base desires, wishes, right, and is not what the soul is seeking, right? The soul is seeking the opposite of that, right? The soul is seeking slavehood with Allah, true humility, and it's seeking the everlasting contentment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is not fleeting, right? But if a person is seeking those things, then all of what they are seeking will cease at the time of death, right? And their death will be exponentially more difficult because they are not only separating from this world, but they're separating from the things for which, that they pursued in this world, and the things that they love, which is their wealth and their status. They'll leave it all behind, so they'll be separating from their beloved. Whereas the one who left aside and understood the reality of wealth and status, that it means nothing unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with you, unless it is used for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Then when they pass away, they are leaving toward their beloved, and their death is nothing less than a blessing in itself, right? So the one who understands that their provision is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, and they see the provision as a means to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they will be content with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them. And because they are content, they are, in actuality, they are the true wealthy people, because the word in Arabic for wealth is ghani, right? And the ghani is the one man la ihtiyaja lahu ila an-nas, right? That the one who has no needs of other people, has no needs of creation, right? Whereas the one who is has wealth and is covetous for more is in need. Therefore, they are the faqir, they are the needy person, right? So true wealth is in the contentment of the self, of the soul, and true poverty is in the covetousness of the soul. And the Prophet ﷺ, right, he constantly tells us, right, that regarding the spending of wealth, right, and he said that three things that I can swear upon is that one, that a person who forgives another for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah does not increase them in anything except for honor. The second being that giving of charity does not decrease from your wealth. Right? And this goes back to the point of having blessing in your wealth, that the wealth that you have suffices all of your needs, right? Even though it's not a lot, as opposed to the one who has lots of wealth, but it is not sufficient for them. Right? So that's a lack of barakah. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the true understanding of wealth and what it's for, and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it for, and how we can refine the intrinsic inclinations of ourselves toward that wealth to have very high and spiritual purposes, and to have truly lofty aspirations in them, and that if we're seeking the wealth, we're not seeking it for anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that if we have the wealth, we're not using it except in that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And to have such conviction that Allah is the provider, so as to prevent ourselves from ever seeking provision from haram means, from means that are displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that is a weakness in our faith. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us ma'amallah, and what has transpired, and to protect us from that which is coming.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was brought to you by Seeker's Guidance, the Global Islamic Seminary. Visit seekersguidance.org to access reliable Islamic knowledge taught by qualified teachers. We offer a wide range of courses, podcasts, articles, and a world-class answer service. Support us in spreading free, reliable Islamic knowledge to millions around the world by becoming a monthly supporter. Visit seekersguidance.org/donate and make a small monthly commitment today. Our beloved Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "Whoever guides someone to goodness will have a similar reward." So don't forget to share this podcast and spread prophetic guidance.